และในช่วงต่อจากนี้นะครับขอเรียนเชิญทุกท่านพบกับนะครับผู้เชี่ยวชาญจาก Lombard Odier Investment Manager Miss Élise Beaufils Deputy Head of Sustainability Research Miss Amy Hu Sustainability Strategist ครับ Please welcome me in joining Miss Élise and Miss Amy to the stage.
Perfect. Hi everyone. Let me just make sure that this is all working perfectly. It's really good to be with you today. Thank you so much for having us. Unfortunately, we'll have to do this session in English as I do not speak Thai. But any question, of course, I'll be very happy to discuss with you afterwards. So what we want to do with this session is have a very practical discussion about sustainability and how we can integrate this into portfolios and investment strategies. We know that sustainable finance has been regulated a lot these past few years in Europe, in the UK, also in Asia. We've seen regulators all across the world bringing together this sustainable finance regulation. So we want to start today by giving you a little bit of an overview of what we've been through in Europe since, I'd say, 2021, 2022. Maybe before we dive into that topic, just a quick overview so that you know where we are coming from and who Lombard is. We are based in Switzerland. This is where we have our headquarters, but we do have offices all over the world. Amy right here is based in the Singapore office, but we also have an office in Hong Kong and in Tokyo. We've got a private bank, but we both work within the asset management arm of Lombard, where we manage more than $60 billion in AUM. Now, we've split the business across different pillars, and the key pillar, obviously, we'll be discussing today is holistic, where we have the core of our sustainable offering. Now, because we wanted sustainability to be a key strategical development for Lombard, as Hubert highlighted earlier today, we've invested a lot of resources into people to develop our own sustainability research capabilities. And so, as you can see on this slide, we've been through quite a journey where we've started by just sending ESG questionnaires to company. Then data providers came in. SET is one of them in Asia. We've got MSCI Sustainalytics. They started collecting the data for us. But what we did at Lombard, we've always committed to creating our own methodologies and metrics. And that's something I'll explain a bit later on today. What we've also done throughout is build strategic partnerships around sustainability. So not just do our research on our own, but look for academics, universities, Oxford, for instance, in the UK, that could support us in doing that work on sustainability and better understand the transition. Now, that's the team as we have it today. We've got more than 40 people fully dedicated to sustainability research. Our end goal is really to embed sustainability conviction into financial analysis. And we complement all of this research with quantitative metrics. We've got data scientists, geospatial analysts in the team that can also cover some very broad investment universe. So now let's dive into the key topic for today, which is sustainable finance regulation. And let's have a little bit of a look at what's been going on in Europe, in the UK, and then we'll touch as well upon Asia. So this is what's been happening since 2020. Lots of regulations everywhere. There is some sort of a common thread across all of these regulations. They all try at the end to support the transition towards a net zero, nature positive, socially inclusive economy. They do that by having regulations that are going to apply to the industry and the economy as a whole, but they also push the finance sector to support directly and to finance that transition of the industries. What they also want to do is to protect the end client, the consumer, from greenwashing risk and making sure that as a financial entity, as an asset manager, when we say that a product, a strategy is sustainable, it truly is. So we're going to start with the European regulation. And I'll try to make this section not as boring as can be. I know that regulation, it's a lot of acronyms. I had to go through that work on your behalf. So I'll try to make it, as synthetic as I can. So in Europe, in here, you see all of the different regulations that we have. We've got EU taxonomy. That's the definition of what is sustainable or not in Europe. So then through all of the activities, they've defined criteria to say, this activity is sustainable, this one is not. That's really our rule book, if I may say, of sustainability in Europe. Then with that, they've associated SFDR. That's really how in Europe, we've been told as an asset manager how we can do a sustainable product or not. So is that strategy sustainable or is it not? And what they're doing as well, we've got something called MiFID. Don't have to remember that name, but basically what we do is that for each client that we see, we need to know if they are interested in sustainability and how they want it integrated. So the same way that when you talk to a client, you need to understand what are their risk appetite from a financial standpoint. We have to do the same on sustainability risk now. So as I was saying, EU taxonomy, this is our rule book for what is sustainable, what is not. At the moment, it's very focused on environment, but it covers all of the thematics. So as Hubert was saying, that for the longest time, people were just looking into climate transition, decarbonization. Well, EU taxonomy is going beyond that. You see the different objectives right here. You do have climate change mitigation, but you also have adaptation, so physical risk. And you go beyond that. You've got circular economy, you've got biodiversity, you've got pollution, you've got water. So it's very exhaustive. And we are still working in Europe on the social taxonomy. That was supposed to come out 2 years ago. We are still waiting for that specific rule book on social contribution. Now, in Europe, how we define what makes an activity taxonomy aligned? Well, first it needs to be eligible to being sustainable. So not all of the activities can be eligible. If you can take maybe accounting, this is not eligible to EU taxonomy. Doesn't mean it's bad. It's just simply not contributing to the transition. So if your activity is eligible, then you need to go through 3 tests. One, you need to demonstrate that you're contributing significantly to the transition, that you're accelerating that transition. Then you need to demonstrate that your activity is not causing any extra harm. So typically, if you are building wind turbine, great, you are contributing to climate change mitigation. But if you are putting a wind turbine in an area where you have to deforest, maybe a primary forest, this is going to cause harm on biodiversity, so you will fail the second test. And then you need to make sure that you're doing all of that with good safeguards in terms of governance. Now, if we get into SFDR, this is how in Europe we go from EU taxonomy, activity definition into asset managers. So SFDR, it's very much when you have a product, a strategy, you want to sell as sustainable or ESG, you have to comply with the SFDR requirements. Now, I'll skip very quickly on that timeline. The key message here is that regulations, they're always changing. That's really the one thing. We've been through many different cycles since SFDR came in place, and there is yet a new evolution to come next year. So with regulation, you need to understand what's in it, how you can make it useful for your business as well, what can drive the structuring of your products, but also expect to have to do a lot of work to adapt every year because the market is changing, clients are changing, and regulation is following as well. Now, that's really the key bit of SFDR. This is really, among all of the sub-things in that regulation, the one thing that you need to remember. The way that SFDR has tried to simplify what makes a product sustainable or not in the finance world is by creating those 3.5 categories. So any fund that does not integrate sustainability or ESG, that's going to be Article 6. Then you've got Article 8. Those are the products that promote environmental and social characteristics. So if you take LOIM, for instance, most of our strategies that are classified Article 8, they do have integration of exclusions, ESG criteria, and sometimes they go a little bit further and they include as well a minimum proportion of sustainable investment. And then you've got Article 9, that's the crème de la crème, as we say in French. This is really the most sustainable fund you can have in Europe. This is also where you're going to have impact funds. And these products, they have to make 100% of sustainable investment. There's no room for compromise in these products. So let's discuss a little bit the UK. And I'll give you a heads up. For that section, I'll also need all of you to participate, because we'll do a little bit of a quiz at the end so that you can see by yourself how difficult it can be to interpret those regulations, but also how it can help the end client understand the product they've been offered. So I'll be making sure that you're listening at the end of this one. So the UK SDR came a little bit after the European regulation, and it pursues the same goal: protect the end client from greenwashing risk and also clarify how sustainable a fund, a strategy, a product is. Now, same as SFDR, in the UK, we had a lot of back and forth, and the regulation has been changing quite a little bit. Now, similarly to Europe, the UK has developed different categories. Everyone complained it's not the same categories as in Europe. And there's been lots of discussions for the past 3 years as to which categories are the best. We are no one to judge. We have to comply with both the UK and the European regulation, but this is one of the challenges. And it's the same when you go to Switzerland or you go to Asia, you're going to see different categories of product, which is not so easy as an international global asset manager. So the categories in the UK, we've got sustainability focus. This is where you have more than 70% of your assets that are sustainable. Stewardship and engagement is also quite important in UK SDR. Then you've got the sustainability improvers. This is for portfolios that are going to focus on the transition. So basically the companies in these portfolios, they're not yet sustainable, but they are on the critical path to be. Then you've got mixed goals. Well, in your portfolio, you've got some sustainable companies and some transitioners. And then you've got impact. Impact, if you will, is a bit of an equivalent to Article 9 in Europe, but this is very much focused on delivering positive environmental or social impact. And the key element here is that you need to be able to demonstrate that you have a direct impact. Through investing in that portfolio, in that company, I am able to bring directly a positive change to the environmental situation or a social situation. I won't dive too much into this slide. I've included that with Amy in your deck so that you can refer to it. This is a tentative to make European regulation and UK regulation speak to one another. So how you can move from one to the other. And as you can see, lots of arrows everywhere. It is not that straightforward. So I think we're going to do a little bit of a quiz now. So you're going to need your phone, and there will be a QR code on the screen. So you just screen that and it will bring you on the quiz. It's anonymous, so you can answer however you want. We won't be chasing you afterwards. I'll just wait a bit to make sure that everyone has it working. Okay, I think it should be fine. So let's move on to the next slide. I'm not sure if I'm able to. Ah, yeah. 41. Okay, I think we've got most people in the room. Oops. Perfect. So what we will do, I've put examples of theoretical funds, so describing what's the investment process, and we're going to ask you to classify these funds in the different categories. So do you think it's a sustainability focus, improvers, mixed goals, or impact? And I'll remind you what are the different categories along the way. So this is the first fund. It's a strategy that invests in equities that support the transition towards a more sustainable future. How they do that? So they tell us that they invest 30 to 40% in high quality companies that are already sustainable. And then they invest 30 to 40% of the fund into companies that are committing to transition, that have net zero targets, that are transitioning towards net zero. So with these informations, do you think this one is more of sustainability focus, so investing mostly in sustainable companies, sustainability transition, investing in the transition towards net zero, net positive economy, mixed goals, a little bit of both, or impact? And I think you should be able to vote now if it works properly on your phone. But it seems we're having issues. Okay, let's just wait a few seconds. Maybe just a matter of not having a good Wi-Fi. Okay, if it's not working with the quiz, that's fine. It'll be a little bit less anonymous, but I'll ask you maybe to raise your hand to vote. So how many of you think that this fund is sustainability focus? Raise your hand. Don't be shy. Okay, so no one. Who thinks that the fund 1, was transition? Then the third category was who thinks it was sustainability mixed goals? Okay, a few more votes. So I guess the rest of the room thinks it's impact, or you're just voting blank. So the correct answer was mixed goals, as most of the room actually voted, because you've got 40% that is going to be sustainable, 40% is going to be transition. The sum of the two will be above the 70% threshold. So that was an easy one, you will see, that was mixed goals. Now we've got the second fund, and this one, they tell us in their marketing materials that they're investing in solution providers to climate change mitigation. And they said that it's a listed equity strategy only. They also said that they're going to be monitoring some impact KPI on their portfolio, like avoided emissions provided by the company. So in your view, and we're going to vote by hand as well, because I'm not sure this one will be working. Let's check, but yeah. So let's vote by hand, that works as well. Who thinks that fund, listed equities, solution providers, impact KPI is sustainability focus? Then vote for transitioners. Thank you. Mixed goals and impact. A few more people. So I've used this one because it's a bit of a trap. A lot of people would answer impact because we talk about impact KPI, we talk about, solution providers, but actually we think this is more of sustainability focus. Because remember, for impact, you need to demonstrate direct contribution through your investment. When you invest in listed equities, it's quite difficult to demonstrate that additionality, right? So if that fund was private equity, 100% it would be impact. But because it is listed equities, it's more difficult to prove that through your investment, you were able to deliver a direct impact. This one was a bit of a trick. Okay, I think the click is not working, so maybe we can go back to the main presentation, the other one with the PDF. Perfect. So again, with this quiz, the idea is really not to show you how complex regulation can be, but it's more for you to realize that there's a lot of interpretation everyone has to take on those different regulation, and that the discussion, we're having on this stage with all of you guys, actually in Europe, we have it every day with our clients. And for any regulator that is setting up sustainable finance regulation, it's always that, end client dimension that's important to keep in mind, because that's how you'll make the regulation successful or not. And maybe I'll let Amy discuss a little bit more the Asian regulation.
Okay, so thank you, Élise. Good afternoon, everyone. So after we've reviewed a little bit of the Europe and UK regulations, we will touch a little bit on the landscape in Asia. It's equally as exciting. So please, we will do a little bit of a quick overview. So I think here we have a nice snapshot of some key milestones in some of the selected countries in Asia that I wanted to highlight. So contrary to Europe and the UK, of course, in Asia, we are at a different, let's say, advancement cycle. So we have had many different developments. Like Élise said, we have consultation, plan, draft. Sometimes it goes back into the plan before it then goes onto the draft. So into a final proposal. So we are always monitoring all of the different developments. Maybe here I wanted to point out that some of the most recent ones in Japan, Singapore, and Thailand are to do with the sustainability data disclosure for corporates. In Asia, we see more and more countries who are embracing the ISSB, IFRS global standards. And this has helped us in achieving some of the similar standards in the EU, like CSRD. And we have a few developments this year, like in Japan, where it was announced that we start with a phase-in sort of implementation to the mandate of having the top 50 market cap listed equities companies first to be required to have those standards, disclosures that are aligned with the global standards. And the similar approach has been taken in Singapore. It's also sort of a phased-in approach for climate disclosure on Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And I think earlier in the keynote speech, we also, maybe I'm guessing that we were talking in Thai also about the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for Set 50 as well. And this, the consultation period has been over, and I think we are reviewing and seeing that we expect as early as next year's financial year to see some reporting already mandated for the top companies in the Set 50. Another interesting part that I wanted to touch base is the taxonomy. So Élise mentioned the EU taxonomy. It's a very good guide for us to be able to guide capital flows into green and transitioning activities in the economy. And in Asia, we have observed that many countries themselves will have their own national level taxonomies. In the ASEAN region, we've seen that actually it's a a global sort of leading, let's say, step to make sure that within the region, all of the member states have some sort of uniform guideline, the same language that all of those national level taxonomies can also speak to each other. And so it's interesting when you have a look at some of the ASEAN member states, most of the approach and the principle of having sort of this traffic light system is uniform across the countries. There are some variations in the implementation, the execution of the taxonomy and how that is sort of adjusted for any country-specific, it could be physical risk implications that could be different between Indonesia and Thailand and Singapore, right? Some countries have embraced more technical screening criteria similar to the EU. Some countries may have a coal fire plant phase-out clause. Some others don't. So it's all quite a nice, encouraging step forward where we acknowledge that the regulations are, they should be a guideline, they should be not too prescriptive and still have some sort of comparability and universal language between the different jurisdictions. So with that, I think the next part we want to go into, I will hand over again to Élise for the EU part to go into a practical example of how the EU SFDR is implemented.
Super, thank you, Amy. So we want to put some numbers on the theory. You've seen EU SFDR, you've seen EU taxonomy. The question that a lot of clients are asking us is, well, this is all great. Can you give us a strategy that's going to be 100% taxonomy aligned? And the answer is on this slide. We've taken, MSCI Europe, for instance, where the disclosure on EU taxonomy should be the best in the world because they have to report as an obligation from the regulation. And as you can see, you've got more than 70% of the MSCI Europe that is not eligible to EU taxonomy. And if you take the alignment to EU taxonomy, that's actually less than 5%. So today, EU taxonomy is great, but you cannot build a portfolio that's going to be 100% EU taxonomy aligned. That's not necessarily a bad news. I think it's simply reflecting the current economic situation. If we had 100% of EU taxonomy alignment, well, it means that we no longer live in an unsustainable world, right? It means that the transition has happened and we're fine. So that 5%, you should see that not just of data issues or poor disclosure, it's also a reflection of where we are as an economy on our transition. And then if you calculate, our sustainability alignment to EU taxonomy on MSCI all countries, you see that the coverage drops from 60% to 10%. And you see as well that the share of aligned revenues is less than 1%. There's also something I want to flag here, and that's something we've worked a lot on within the research team. It's not just that businesses are less sustainable in emerging markets than in Europe. It's also that EU taxonomy is focused on Europe. And so the criteria that they set, they work very well for European companies. But we know that the transition is not going to happen the same way in emerging markets as it will in Europe. And that's also why having these taxonomies that Amy was mentioning is so important. I cannot have the same carbon emission threshold in Europe as I have in Asia. We need to recognize as well that these countries have different economies, different history. They haven't emitted as much as we did in Europe, and therefore the criteria needs to be adapted as well. Now, there's one point that we've touched on a little bit. We've talked about EU taxonomy alignment. In SFDR, I've mentioned a few times sustainable investment. That's a word that anywhere else than in Europe, you can use quite, liberally. In Europe, when you say sustainable investment, it brings you directly to SFDR, and it has a regulatory meaning behind it. So you need to be quite careful with that. That's the definition we have in Europe. I won't make you go through it. It thinks similarly to EU taxonomy. It says contribution, but cause no significant harm and have a good governance. But it lets you, as an asset owner and asset manager, define those three tests. So you can use EU taxonomy, or you can do many more things. Some people, they're going to use just ESG score. We think it's a little bit light. So I'll show you the definition that we have at Lombard Odier. That's our simplified definition. For contribution, we do use EU taxonomy. We've just made the criteria a bit more practical, and we've integrated some dedicated criteria for regions outside Europe, so that our definition we can use across the world on any portfolio. We also want to be forward-looking. Typically, if we look into an electric utility that still has a coal power plant but is planning to close it by the end of the year, well, this is exactly what we would call a sustainable investment. So we have that forward-looking view where we look into CapEx, targets, credibility of transition. Then for assessing the no significant harm, we look into a range of quantitative indicators. We also have qualitative analysis, and we also have a list of red activities. These red activities, it's not an exclusion policy, it's just a list of activities where we think, look, if you have too much of that, you can't really be sustainable. So typically coal power generation, if you have too much of coal power generation, you won't be sustainable. Same for energy. Hubert was mentioning oil in his keynote speech. If you have too much oil production, you won't be sustainable. But we go beyond that. We look into socially harming activities. So tobacco, alcohol production, and so on and so forth. If you have too much of these, it's going to fail the do no significant harm test. And for governance, well, we look into your usual governance analysis. We look into the structure of the board. We look into audit, remuneration disclosure. And we do try to tailor a little bit that governance assessment to the different countries. We're discussing recently with Tida Siri, actually, that in Japan, you cannot assess the companies the same you do in Europe because the regulation is different. So I thought I would give you an example on a company of how this framework works, because that will show you how we integrate then in a portfolio and how we can have the discussion with the portfolio manager. So let me take Mercedes as an example. So the German company, auto manufacturer. If you take Mercedes today, the automotive that they manufacture, well, most of them, they're still, traditional ICE vehicles, so diesels and fuel engines. The percentage of electric vehicles, it's quite small. So Mercedes today, not really contributing in our view. But if you want to be forward-looking, let's see what Mercedes has put in place. And they've done quite a few very interesting things. First, they've committed that 50% of their fleet would be electrified by 2030. That's 50% of their sales. That's quite ambitious. And that's despite EU regulation that has moved back a little bit on this. So Mercedes is still committed to that target. On top of it, we've looked into their CapEx, so where are they putting their money every year in terms of investment? And it's going to support the electrification of the fleet. And then on top of that, and that's something that we really like, they're not just committing to putting their money towards electrification, they're also committing to reducing significantly their investment in their current, ICE diesel engine manufacturers. So with these targets, with the CapEx, with what we've seen for the past 3 years, we pass contribution on that forward-looking basis. Then for the do no significant harm test, we look a little bit into what could be material from an ESG perspective for the company. So we've looked into the materials that they use. Do they try to integrate some circular economy thinking? Are they thinking about recycling the batteries? Are they thinking about the sourcing of the materials? And we think that the company has best-in-class practices there. We also look into controversies. And in here, we haven't seen any significant event in the past few years from an environmental and social standpoint. So we pass the do no significant harm test, and then we look into governance. And with Mercedes, we've had a few issues quite some time ago. You might remember the Dieselgate. That was roughly 10 years ago. So some significant governance issues in the past. So we had to do a lot of work to unpack this. And we've looked into it, and we've seen that Mercedes has changed quite a lot of their processes since the Dieselgate. They've changed a few people in the management. They've changed their audit process as well. And they've put all of the safeguards to avoid such a thing to happen again. So with this in mind, for us, the Dieselgate, it's long in the past, and we're confident with the company's practices. And we haven't seen any other significant concerns from a governance standpoint. So Mercedes is the typical case of a company where we pass contribution as a transitioner. We see no issues in terms of potential harm. The governance is correct. Well, the company is a sustainable investment. So I hope that gives you a bit more of an idea of how we implement, practically speaking, all of these very theoretical regulation. And I think we'll keep it on the practical side, and Amy is going to present you an overview of the market, how are asset owners and asset managers integrating this at portfolio level.
Okay, great. So in the next section, we will have a little bit of sort of a stock take, let's say, of the current level, current variations of how sustainability is integrated by asset owners and asset managers across the world. So one thing that we wanted to look at first is the net zero targets, the decarbonization targets that have been sort of a up and down journey for us in the last, let's say, 3-5 years. With the asset owners, net zero asset managers, alliances. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with them. We've seen a big uptick in many signatories on the asset owners and asset managers side who commit to aligning their AUM towards a net zero aligned economy. Of course, we know that for the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance, we've had a few big names, US names, pull out of the alliance, and now it's under a suspension. However, as Hubert was mentioning in his keynote speech, actually, when you look at the corporates in the market, companies, businesses, we recognize that net zero targets also reflect that the companies are very aware of some of the long-term risks that not aligning to net zero could bring to their businesses in the long run. Right, so you see on this side, the corporate net zero targets chart, we are still steadily in an uptick. You'll see there's a little bit of a sort of distinction between the SBT, this is the Science Based Targets Initiative, who are external bodies that are validating the corporate's net zero claims, net zero commitments. So we've seen a little bit of sort of a softening, which means corporates are not necessarily choosing to go through the Science Based Targets Initiative to explain their net zero commitments to the investors and to the market. However, we see this trend that when we are looking at businesses, they still think that it makes business sense, economically speaking, to have awareness around net zero. Okay, next. So now I wanted to take a little bit of stock on the different ways that we have seen sustainability and ESG being integrated in the market. So this is a chart to show globally the AUM and how they are split within different colors of sustainability. We can talk about sustainability, one word, ESG, one word, but when we say that, there are different ways, different approaches that the market has embraced that. So first we start with the inclusions. So the inclusions category is simply looking at, let's say we start with a core broad strategy and we add a few exclusion criteria like I don't want any controversial weapons. I don't want any unconventional oil and gas, things like this. The integration engagement, this second category, it relates to systematically, quantitatively integrating some sort of ESG or sustainability criteria in the investment process, as well as integrating an engagement process to the investee companies in the portfolio. The sustainability thematic investment, this is what Hubert was mentioning that got a lot of headwind in the last few years, where we have thematic boundaries in the investment universe, such as renewable energy, such as circular economy, such as biodiversity, things like this. And we will have very restricted and defined, clear definition of what kind of investments sit in the thematic for that portfolio. We have best in class, which means we are sort of taking the best ESG leaders within a group. It could be the market sector. It could be sector and region, something like this. And then lastly, we have impact investing, which Élise mentioned already. It needs to be adding some sort of environmental or social impact on top of financial returns. And you will see that actually much of the market right now, it goes into the exclusions and integration categories, where we go into a little bit more of the, let's say, it requires a little bit more research and a lot more implementational labor, a bit more dense. So those are the green ones on the bottom. It's still a small part of the global AUM for now. Okay, now we look at all of the Article 8 and Article 9 funds that are available on the market and what type of investments they sit under. So on the left side, the light green, we have the Article 8. And actually global active equities. That is the most commonly found types of products within Article 8. Now, if we go into Article 9, we have the sectors and themes in equities as well. And if you look across the board, Article 8 and 9, common to both of them, you see a lot of equities, right? So this is something that we already know, that sustainability is often, we start by looking at the equities first rather than the fixed income. Within the Article 9, you will see here at the very end here, the bonds, undefined, global active. So this, mostly in Article 9, it would be labeled bonds. It would be funds that are dedicated to green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, which have a KPI linked to the coupon payment of the bond. Okay, this is something that I found interesting. So when we looked at the whole spectrum of all different types of sustainable investing and responsible investing, we can kind of split them into two big groups. So one is the green, which is ESG focus. So this, we will say, is sort of the Article 9s of the world. The ones that have a more defined, clear identity as a product, where sustainability is a core engine, a central engine of the product offering. Then we have the brown, which is all other responsible investing. So that includes exclusions only products. It also includes best in class. We also include, the full spectrum, right? So now when you look at this, from 2018 all the way to 2021, both have been growing quite equally. Whereas once we get to 2022, 2023, we see that the ESG focus, they are proving a lot more resilient than the broader responsible investing products. So this is in terms of net flows, right? Maybe I haven't studied this, and the research only shows the data. I can only give you my interpretation why. But in 2022, 2023, we had many macro environmental headwinds, right? Inflationary pressure, rates. And in an environment where we have more sort of performance pressure, it might have been that the responsible investing sort of category within asset owners or within the market in broad felt that the responsible investing was kind of, it didn't have a clear identity, and maybe it was just a nice to have, and maybe even a proxy to some more vanilla core strategies. So this is one theory. The other theory is for ESG focused type funds, because of the Article 9 type level of commitment and alignment to sustainability, we think that the client base for ESG focused funds are maybe stickier. Maybe the clients are more driven by regulation. Maybe they are driven more by their voluntary willingness to make sure that they have specific goals in their portfolio, and therefore could be just resilient in the long term overall as well. So this I found quite interesting. And then next, here again is just to illustrate the same point. We have many different ways of implementing and executing a sustainability portfolio. Right now, here on the slide, we are showing a list of funds that are all listed equities thematic portfolios. Different funds, right? And let's say that they are all focusing on something like biodiversity as a theme. Even so, you see that when we look at the framework, the indicator used, and even something as simple as, do you want exclusions in your portfolio or not? There's a very wide variety of how that biodiversity fund is being implemented. Okay, next we want to give a little bit of perspective of some asset owner case studies. So here we are talking about a UK pension fund. I think is similar to maybe some of you in this room they have a mandate to make sure their pensionees receive long-term resilient portfolios at time of retirement, and therefore because of this more long-dated fiduciary duty that they have to their center, to their core of the approach, an ESG and sustainability aware mindset. And if you look at an institution like that and their asset allocation, so it looks quite striking here, but maybe almost half of their allocation, including the developed equities and also the emerging market equities, are labeled as climate aware. So what does that mean? It means that they are looking to make sure to reduce the exposure to any investee companies who are at risk of exposing themselves to climate-related downfalls. So in that case, they have explicitly mentioned in their allocation like this, but really what it means is they take a sort of base core allocation to developed equities, let's say, and they have sort of a climate tilt towards that. Now, I must say, when we put this in perspective, they are a leader. This UK institution is a leader in this space, but we have definitely, even in Asia, seen, for example, Japan's public pension, GPIF. They have just this summer recently announced that they will increase sustainability and ESG aware allocation.
Maybe I'll talk about the example of a Swiss private bank. We know that integration of sustainability is going to be a little bit different if you are serving institutional clients, pension fund, and if you are serving, retail investors. And so I wanted to give that example of the private bank because we had to work very closely with them to create a range of strategies, of mandates that they could offer private clients that tick that sustainability preference box when we onboard them in our system. And one of the challenges when clients come to you and say, we want to integrate sustainability is what and how? Because that means a lot of different things. If we were to do a survey in the room, what do you think is sustainable? Everyone, for sure, will have a different approach to that. And so we came up with those 3 pillars that allow to preserve the capital of our client, to generate returns, and to have quite some flexibility to tailor the mandate to their requirement. So we have 3 pillars. The first one I'll talk about is resilience. As Amy said, we know that we've had some turbulent years since 2021, 2022. And we wanted for clients to have that resilience pillar. So it's the core of their portfolio. It needs to be well diversified. We cannot take too many risks from a tracking error perspective. We want to be very close to the benchmark, but we still want to integrate sustainability in here. So that's where we're going to find some of the exclusion. This is where we'll have, ESG integrating kind of a fund. This is where we'll be able to pursue some more systematic strategies around decarbonization that we'll talk about in a sec. Once we have that resilience pillar that's really there to guarantee, good performance, stable against the benchmark, we're going to add one pillar that we call thematic. This is where if the client has a preference, or I'm really into the water thematic or climate thematic, this is where we can play. There's a bit more high conviction thematic card. This is also where, depending on the macro cycle, we can play a theme against another. As we've seen, as we've known, electric utilities not been doing so well on the equity market recently. So this is typically a theme that we can underplay a little bit at the moment and play a little bit more circular economy, which has been doing quite well. So we can also use that pillar to play some moment in the macro cycle. And then, not for every client, we can also implement impact. That's where you'll find illiquid assets. So private equity, infrastructure, a little bit of private debt. This pillar we can bring for the client that are the most sophisticated and that have the strongest preferences in terms of ESG. So I think this one is a quite nice approach because it allows us to customize the approach to the client and also not have too many biases compared to the benchmark and reduce some potential difficult discussion around performance.
Okay, great. Thank you, Élise. So I think that provided a little bit of a landscape into where we stand today and how sustainability is integrated into portfolios as of today by the market. Next, we want to talk about, okay, other than complying to mandatory regulation, other than following guidelines set by the legislation, why do we, over and above, see meaning to integrating sustainability in portfolios? And I think Hubert already covered this topic quite nicely in his keynote speech. So I will try and go very quickly in this section. But what he said, what Hubert mentioned was pain points are becoming acute in the economy as of today. So we had examples of our healthcare system, of our agriculture system, of our energy system. All of these very acute pain points, we think, are inevitably leading us to some systems changes that lead us to a more sustainable economy tomorrow. As investors, as asset managers ourselves, and as asset owners, we have the fiduciary duty to invest in our economy tomorrow to ensure that we have long-term resilient portfolios. So we think it's very, very important to do this research on sustainability because it is a necessary ingredient to the recipe for success in our business. Hubert mentioned the pain points, the environmental ones, the social ones. We are seeing that they're all being breached. Well, not all yet, but most of them, a lot of them are being breached as of today, especially the environmental ones. We see some very striking examples that he also mentioned with the home insurance in the US, for example, right? There is this research, I'm sure you have, maybe if you haven't seen it, there is a Netflix documentary called Breaking Boundaries. Yes, Breaking Boundaries. This slide is a capture of the Breaking Boundaries documentary, but it is basically showing you very different, various striking different indicators that scientists have proven how far we have broken some of those boundaries and led to acute pain points in our systems. So here we think about how some of the pain points, the acute pain points in the net zero, in the energy system and in the nature system and in the social system will lead us to some of these inevitable end states. So we have been hearing today many times that we will be transitioning into a net zero, nature positive, and socially constructive economy. This is sort of our picture, let's say, of how we think the world will look like tomorrow. This is what we have on the bottom. What we have on the top is where we are today, and the systems change, the middle, is the transition that we expect we see in our economy. So as investors, we need to be aware of those systems change in order to preserve our business. And for us, why are we so invested in understanding these systems changes? Well, it's because we've seen many examples. We've witnessed it many times in history. So this it shows you how equity markets, so we're using equity markets as a proxy here. We're showing how economies have been reshaped and restructured triggered by systems change. So if I take, for example, the top left, this is the transportation sector from the 1800s to the late 1900s. We have seen transformation of the transportation system from mainly horse carriages into rail. And why was that? It was because there was an acute pain point in the economy at the time where we were approaching boundaries of a logistical transportation capacity and efficiency. And therefore we had innovation, we had CapEx deployed, and we transitioned from a horse carriage main transportation system into rail. Right, that then reflected in how the economy, how the equity markets looked as of those decades. Centuries, actually, sorry. And then for the energy system as well, from wood-based energy to fossil fuels. This was another pain point, addressing another pain point in the energy system breaching and approaching some limits, right? So we've seen that many times in history, and we think it's why we need to look at how systems changes will impact and what the relationship is between the economy. And this is the same message, but in earnings. The previous slide was market cap. We've seen for the last few decades, the IT revolution. It's hard to imagine actually sitting here now that just 30 years ago, only 5% of market earnings made up of IT. And now we are talking about Mag 7 all the time, right? So why is that? It's because in the last 30 years, we've seen CapEx being deployed and the earnings pool completely reshaped. Actually, in sustainability, there's research that says in this decade, we will be investing the same amount as what we invested in the 2010s for IT. So that then makes us think, okay, how are earnings going to be shifted in the market in the next few decades, right? So really it's about understanding those pain points, the systems changes, in order to sort of have a direction, have a map of how we think this has implications in different sections of the market. Here we are saying that for our systems changes that we see as of today, the ones that are surrounding sustainability, actually, we see them across different sectors. It's not just about renewables and industrials, as Hubert said. It's also about healthcare. It's also about consumers. Right. So when we look at the inevitable future of net zero, nature positive, and socially constructive, actually you will see that it is touching all corners of the market. It's not just one part. And that's what really makes us think that beyond just the compliance of regulation, it is really a necessary step for us to research, study these systems changes, the transition to sustainability, for our business.
So what Amy has shown you, it's probably one of the tools that we have at Lombard Odier when we want to build a portfolio. And the one she described is the one that we use mostly in our high conviction thematic equities strategies. Now, we have many more tools that we can use, and I think it's important to think about sustainability once you have that conviction that for our fiduciary duty, we need to integrate sustainability. It's going to drive returns in the future. You need also to understand that you need to have several tools at your disposal, and you're not always going to use the same tool for the same strategy, depending on the goal and the objective that you're pursuing. So I want to give you a bit of an overview of our toolbox, and we keep on working on that. We keep on refining our tools and creating new ones because we want to be able to capture that transition across all of the different systems that Amy has highlighted. So this is an overview of the toolbox that we have. You have exclusions, that's kind of like your first tool, like the hammer you can use across the board, not very precise, but quite useful. Then you're going to look into ESG integration. You'll go a little bit further than exclusion. You're going to look into business practices here and there. And then we get into what at Lombard Odier we think is core sustainability integration, where we think we can drive returns as well. And this is transition and sustainability focus. How can we do some climate transition investing? And we have quite a few tools in that space. And how can we integrate that system change analysis that Amy has just mentioned? And then there is one more tool that you can really use across the board. And that's really cross-cutting the different tools that I've mentioned. It's stewardship, engagement, and proxy voting for the equity strategy. And stewardship should be really seen as a way for you to accelerate the transition in your portfolio and probably also generate additional returns by positioning better the companies you have in portfolio. So we're going to go through each of the tools. Exclusion, that's the example that we have at LOIM. When we think about exclusion, we do not just think in terms of what is wrong or bad, if I may say. There is obviously that element that comes in play, but we also try to anticipate in our exclusion the risks of stranded assets. So the risk of holding assets in our portfolios and strategies that might be worth nothing or very little in the coming years within our investment horizon. So what we exclude at the moment controversial weapons, essential food commodities. This is very much for ethical reasons, and there is also legal implications around controversial weapons, as you very well know. But we also restrict some other activities. Coal is an example of what we think is a stranded asset. Across the world, we've seen that transition out of coal. We've had specific guidelines in OECD, full phase out by 2030, in emerging economies, full phase out by 2040. That's very much within our investment horizon as well. So for companies that are still very much relying heavily on coal, more than 10% of their revenues, that have no transition plan, we're going to exclude them from a portfolio because we think they're going to be stranded and there's significant financial risks within those. Then we exclude as well tobacco. Tobacco, that's something that became, quite standard in Europe, actually. We've seen, a lot of the ESG label and regulators pushing on tobacco exclusion. And then we complement that with excluding unconventional oil and gas, again, 10% of revenues. This is simply because we believe that at the moment, oil and gas is still needed. As Hubert said, we know that oil is going to be phased out, but at the moment it's still very pregnant in our energy mix across the world. Gas is quite useful for the transition at the moment as well, but unconventional, this is probably the most unsustainable way to actually extract energy from the ground. So shale gas, Arctic oil and gas exploration, tar sands, companies that are investing heavily in these activities will be banned for portfolios. So again, exclusions, not just about ethics, but how can we anticipate and protect ourselves from stranded assets risk? Then we look into ESG. That's a snapshot of our ESG methodology. This one is proprietary to Lombard Odier. We wanted to have our own tool just so that it would not be a black box, because we've experienced that with black boxes or portfolio managers, they're less comfortable integrating the scores in their portfolio management. So this is our own methodology. It focuses on business practices, but MSCI, Sustainalytics, you name it, many of the providers have their own ESG scoring methodology. So with this, we want to focus on business practices. We don't look into business model at that point. We just want to make sure that the companies operate their activities in a manner that is as sustainable as can be. And we're also able to look into that through the lens of the SDGs, which can be quite useful for a few sectors. Then we'll get onto climate transition investing. And I think this is where the industry has done a lot of work for the past 5 years. When you want to do climate transition investing, when you want to go beyond ESG and exclusions, the first thing you have to do is carbon footprint analysis. We've heard it, as Amy mentioned, and as was mentioned during the keynote, carbon reporting is very important. It's the first step. If we don't have the carbon footprint of a company, it's going to be very difficult to actually assess how it's positioned towards the transition. I'll just do a very quick recap of carbon footprint, but scope 1, you look into the direct emissions of the company. That's like the smoke that's coming out of the chimney of the factory. Then you have scope 2. This is the electricity. So we are in this room, there's a screen, there's light. This is, indirectly emitting greenhouse gas emissions. That's scope 2. Then you've got scope 3. The screen has been manufactured somewhere in a factory. That's the upstream angle. And then we have downstream. This is the use of the product. So when you look into a company, ideally speaking, you want to look across all of the 3 scopes. Because if you take, for instance, Mercedes, that we were discussing earlier today, well, Mercedes, you're going to see the transition in the scope 3 downstream, the use of the product. That's how you can differentiate an electrical vehicle from a diesel engine vehicle. And then when you do transition investing, you need to go even one step further. Because we are not just about transitioning our portfolio, we also want to deliver on our fiduciary duty and hopefully benefit from transition opportunities and reduce the climate risk, the carbon risk in our portfolio. If you want to do that, you need to go beyond carbon footprint. You need to assess if the company is transitioning and if it's transitioning credibly. And so in here, we have a tool in our toolbox that's called temperature, ITR, implied temperature rise, that we've built internally as well, that tells us if the whole economy was to behave as this company or that portfolio, what would be the level of global warming at the end of the century? Like it's very physical and scientifically grounded. And so with this, I can assess any company, any portfolio, and see if it's aligned with the goal of the Paris Agreement. Then we were talking a little bit about stewardship. That's really the tool to accelerate the transition in your portfolio. At Lombard Odier, we engage with two objectives in mind, either because we want to make a positive contribution, or because we think we can accelerate the transition and that will benefit to the financials of the company. So we always engage with these two objectives in mind, and we want to do that across a different set of themes, and we're going to use different tools as well. When you do engagement, if us, Lombard Odier, we go talk to Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, it's going to be quite difficult, right? Because they're very big and we're quite small in comparison. So when you do engagement, you need to target the right company, and you need also to select the efforts you're going to put into that. So when targeting the largest companies, we're happy to do collaborative engagement. We're going to join with different asset managers to have a bit more lever on the companies. When we engage with Swiss companies, well, it's a bit easier for us and we can go directly, and we bring our sustainability expertise with us. So now we'll give you a few examples of portfolios. I'm also mindful of time, but I think we should be right on it. So we'll give you some example of, portfolios, strategies. You've seen the tools, you've seen the philosophy. Now, what does it look like in high conviction equities, in a resilient portfolio that has a low tracking error, and what can we do in terms of impact in private assets?
Okay, great. So those are the three product groups that we are going to showcase you as examples. And I will start with high conviction equities. So high conviction equities, we can think of as, let's say it's a portfolio of 50 to 70 stocks. The way that, as an example, we have integrated it in our business is that we have very bottom-up research that drives the investment decision-making process of those products. And this snapshot, I think, is a simple way to illustrate that. So when we talk about, let's say, global active equities products, oftentimes we think of the process as this kind of funnel process, right? We start with a big, broad universe. We do some selection, some filtering. We come to let's say, an investment focus research list. We do a little bit more filtering. We do some stock selection, and then a final little bit of adjusting of the overweight, underweight to end up with the portfolio. So in a global equities vanilla, let's say, portfolio, it might be this very straightforward funnel. For us, how we have integrated it with sustainability is from step one, from the very, very top, where we define our investable universe. We already look at systems change analysis. We look at what we discussed earlier about the transition to net zero, the transition to nature positive, what that means for social as well. And what that means for social as well. And from that, we understand, okay, maybe there will be some interesting opportunities in regenerative agriculture within the nature system. Maybe there are lots of exciting opportunities that have been overlooked by the market in social systems, in consumers, in healthcare, and maybe some in financials. right? And we can pinpoint, okay, within consumers, maybe we want to be exposed, or we want to circle our hunting ground for investment within a very specific part of consumer. And that's how we define and we draw the perimeter of our investment universe. So the sort of sustainability is step one of our alpha generating investment decision-making process already in the investment universe. Then following that, we will, of course, when we come down to the stock level, stock selection, we will see different checks at the stock level to make sure that it is consistent with our thesis. And then have the rest of the process be similar to that of a global equities strategy, where we have analysts making sure the valuation assessment is in line with expectations, that it is really something that is mispriced by the market and we can capture alpha, and have some top-down risk controls at the end. So that's one example. That's the high conviction equities example, how that sustainability is integrated in those products.
So now I'll show you a second example. If you want to fill in your resilient bucket that we were discussing earlier, how do you do that? How do you integrate sustainability? How can you still benefit from transition opportunities without taking too much risks compared to your benchmark in terms of tracking error? So this is the example of the target net zero philosophy that we have, where, as I was saying, when we want to do climate transition investing, we do not want just to focus on low carbon, because we don't think that investing just in services and software is what's going to build a resilient portfolio over time. We do think that having exposure to utilities, industrial materials that are the cement, literally, of our economy is important to benefit from transition opportunities. So we want to be forward-looking. And the way we do that, where we combine two of the tools that we have at disposal, we look into carbon footprint vertically, and we look into temperature horizontally. So to make it very simple, we basically look at how polluting the companies are today, and then we look, are they decarbonizing, and are they decarbonizing fast enough? And with this, any portfolio manager at Lombard Odier, any of our client, they can run that analysis on their portfolio, and they can see how many low carbon names they have and how many ice cubes versus burning logs they have. Ice cubes, they are literally cooling down the atmosphere and global warming. They are polluting today, but they are transitioning quickly, credibly, and they can help actually drive us towards net zero. These names, we think there are opportunities for investment, and we want to overweight them in our portfolios. Then we're going to have the burning logs. These guys, highly polluting today, no sign of decarbonization. This is where we see risk of having stranded assets. So in strategies that are focusing on climate transition, while maybe you do not invest in them at all, or if you want to keep a low tracking error, you keep them in portfolio, but you underweight them quite significantly. So you've got a nice example of how we can have that target net zero philosophy. You keep a tracking error that's going to be below 1%, so very contained against the benchmark. You're going to have a portfolio temperature that's going to be below 2 degrees, so aligned with the goal of the Paris Agreement. And you're going to see every year actual decarbonization, not simply because you're invested in software, but because the companies in portfolio are transitioning towards net zero. And finally, the last example that we wanted to share with you today to illustrate the third pillar of, a sustainable offering where you integrate across all asset classes is a bit more impact, but impact without compromising on financial returns. When we discuss impact investing at Lombard Odier, and I'm sure as most of you, we're not doing philanthropy, right? We want to generate returns, and on top of that, we want to generate a positive impact. And private equity is quite, the right asset class if you want to do this. So I've included here an example that I think is very relevant across the world, and maybe even more, here in Thailand, we wanted to discuss plastics. That's become a global problem. We hear a lot about greenhouse gas emissions, but plastic is, under discussion to have a global treaty, as I'm sure you've heard of, over the summer. Plastic is now everywhere in our economy. We have plastics in packaging. We have plastic in our automotive. If you take your smartphone, it's 30% plastic. Probably my skirt is part plastic as well. So if we want to transition out of plastic, we need to be able to tackle the entire plastic value chain: production, usage, end of life, collection, sorting, and eventually, hopefully, recycling. And we felt that this was a great opportunity to deliver a positive impact. We know that plastic is very dangerous for biodiversity. It's also dangerous for human health. We all have plastics inside our blood, our brain. We've seen more and more research coming out online around plastics. But on top of it, we think that the moment is quite right to invest. There are a lot of opportunities in the plastic value chain. And you see how we can tie impact and financial returns here. Regulation is pushing. We have regulation in Indonesia. We have one in Singapore. We have one in Europe as well. They are going to ban single-use plastics by 2030. That's tomorrow in private equity investment horizon. They are also forcing some plastic taxes on corporates, and they are putting threshold for recycled content being put on the market. So regulation is pushing, and it's pushing very hard, maybe even harder than it is in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. On top of it, the corporates, they're looking for these solutions. They know that they cannot manufacture plastics and products as they are doing today. They're looking for the technologies. They don't have them. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to buy the small companies, the startups that have the technology that they need. And we've seen that so many times over the past few years. And finally, in the private equity space, it's the right time to have capital to deploy, because the valuation, they've been insanely high around 2020, but they've come down. So if you have capital to deploy at the moment, the valuation are quite low. You've got a nice exit horizon that's ahead of you in 2030, thanks to regulation and corporates. So this is a nice way where you can generate returns in that asset class. And that's what we are trying to do. Typically, with a strategy around plastics, we want to generate positive impact. So avoid plastic waste and also reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the plastic value chain. But we want to do that by investing in companies, private, at growth stage, so on that path toward profitability. And we want to do this by targeting, 18% IRR net of fees. So that's, returns that are competitive with a non-impact strategy. So that's really, I think, for us, the illustrative example of how you can combine sustainability, generate returns across all of the asset classes. And I think that will actually conclude our presentation today. If you have any question and if we have a bit of time, very happy to take them, else we can discuss at the break as well. Thank you.
Thank you.